Hi everyone. I'm so excited about this challenge. I was hoping to start it today, which would be great if you did day 0 today. If not, you can start from tomorrow. So we'll have one grace day. And then I appreciate all of the people who take the challenges and get a chance to do them. That's very awesome. And I'm sure you will all see the difference in your future works for sure. So this exercise is a very essential exercise, both in drawing world, in the world of drawing, and in the world of watercolor and general art and visual art. So it's basically studying light. And what I like about this is how this one is actually breaking it down to kind of all the different words that we use. So this is basically the highlight, right? And highlight is usually the place where you have the light source, totally reflecting on it. And that's where you see the highlight. And then you have the cast shadow and you have the core shadow. So the core shadow is a shadow that happens right after the highlight. So why it's not on this side and it's on this side? Obviously, not obviously, I mean, that's just a great question. It's because like we have the light coming from this side. So usually, as you see, there's a little bit darkness on the other side, and definitely the core shadow here where the light kind of stops and doesn't get to travel on the other side, right? So then you have a little bit of less shadow, just like here, which is called reflected light, right? So it's like the light that is reflected that we said that is trying to make its way all the way here, but it doesn't. Here it kind of stops, and whatever that makes it this way is like the light that is reflected on the other side. And so depending on the amount of light, these highlights can be bigger or smaller. And what is challenging when you're trying to apply that into your watercolor technique and watercolor paintings is that basically the highlights in watercolor are usually the areas that you keep the lightest, either by keeping those areas white, which means you are going to keep the white of the paper, or just use wetness or water is basically your white in watercolor. Or you can kind of like use some sort of very, very faded underwash, like a very nice underwash to kind of give your painting a cool or warm or whatever ambiance. So now when we want to kind of translate what we just talked about in the cylinder thing in different shapes, the reason we study different shapes and you can apply this to other objects is because it helps us see how this light source, depending on the shape of the object, can change, like the shape of the shadows and the shape of the highlighted area, and everything is much dependent on the shape of and the form of the shape that you are working on. So for instance, in the case of the cylinder, you see the cast shadow looks just like a cylinder almost, right? But like, of course, there is an area that the shadow is attached to your object. It's like they're inseparable. And the same thing about these guys. So as you see, their shadows, their cast shadows are all very similar shape to what you are actually working on. The question is, are we going to do this exercise wet on wet or wet into wet or wet on dry? We can do both, and we are actually going to get different looks, of course, because if you're trying to get all these soft edges that you see here, that will tell you this has been done wet on wet, because you can see how all of these edges are soft and the bleeding and spreading has happened very evenly in most of the areas, and there is no hard edge in most of these shapes. The only hard edge that we see is the cast shadow area. The cast shadow area, even the cast shadow areas, you're going to do a gradient wash, because you see as you are getting farther away from this object, your cast shadow is going to also get lighter. So that's also something to consider. So the light sources, if you're considering, is here on this one. You see you have the highlight area, and this one is like kind of the same shape as your circle. But the reason it's not right in the center is because like light is coming from up there. And as you remember, there is a little bit of what we call the reflected light kind of around it here and here. So you have here what we call the core shadow, right? And then you have the reflected shadow, and then you have the cast shadow, which is way darker, closer to the object, and way lighter as it gets farther from the object. The size of these shadows really depends on the amount of light that is shedding on the object. So we see that depending on how much light you get, they usually change. So I would say the best way to do it is just observing the shadow. So usually when you put an object in front of you to paint it, you are going to see the shadows and reflections. And that's why I was asking for objects and stuff, so that we don't have to go look at AI or online or look at other paintings. I would say this is something that you basically can create a composition or an arrangement, and it can be anything, any object. It doesn't have to be the things I mentioned, or just like really hopefully helpful as something to do as guidelines, but you can kind of do your own version of everything. So going back to them, so depending on the shadow like that you see, you can change that as needed, right? So then you have this cube shape, and the same thing about the cube shape. And we see that the light is still coming from this way. So you have all of the lighter areas here, and the same thing here. You have the lighter areas here, then you have the core shadow, reflected shadow, da 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 da. One thing we want to consider is that the cast shadow is always on the opposite side of the highlight, right? So that's just something that we can definitely keep in mind. So this is just like a little blurb about everything, and in the next video I'm going to do these shapes, and I'm going to do the wet on wet technique and explain the process a little bit more.